From WKNOW, this is Steve Chanley with One Question Too Many. Today's program is made possible by the law firm of Employer Advocates Group, serving California employers since 2002, with offices in Orange County and San Luis Obispo County, California. eaglawgroup.com. We're joined today by Keith Wetmore. He's the former chair and chief executive partner of the international law firm of Morrison and Foerster. He is currently the managing director of the San Francisco office of the legal and executive search firm Major Lindsay in Africa. Thanks for joining us today, Keith.
My pleasure, Steve.
How long have you been an attorney?
I graduated from University of Michigan in 1980. Clerked for a year on the Second Circuit and then started practice in San Francisco.
For which judge did you serve as a clerk?
Judge Lombard. Well, he had been on the Second Circuit longer than I'd been alive. And so it was certainly a huge learning experience. It also taught me I didn't want to be a litigator. It was just the nature of the shrill argument of litigation kind of put me off. And so it was, I guess, a year well spent, better than having spun my wheels as an unhappy litigator for a couple of years.
You attended Northwestern as an undergrad and the University of Michigan, as you just mentioned. Are you originally from the Midwest?
I'm a Hoosier, Northwest in Valparaiso, Indiana. So yes, I didn't stray that far for several years from my hometown, I guess.
I just have to ask you this. Do you refer to Northwestern as the Harvard of the Midwest?
No. I don't think anyone should use that term about the Midwest or any other place.
How many years were you with Morrison and Foerster?
My career, when I speak to law students, I like to point out that I've had everything happen in my career at the beginning that's supposed to be like the end of your career. I had a summer where I didn't get a summer offer at Wetmore. My first job was at a small firm in San Francisco that kind of fell apart while I was there. And anyway, I got laid off 6 months after I started. And so I came to MoFo a bit as a refugee I guess that's about a year and a half out of law school. So I spent 35 years at MoFo. And I kind of in a couple of different chapters. I practiced law for 20-ish years. I was a debt finance lawyer, which I enjoyed a great deal. I represented banks and insurance companies and aircraft lessors and people who financed aircraft and rail cars and lots of interesting transactional stuff. And I loved that practice. And then kind of to my shock and surprise, 1999, the firm asked me if I would take on the job of being chair of the firm. And so originally I was quite committed to keeping my practice going. It proved that the two are not particularly compatible endeavors. When it's compensation committee meeting time and you've got 15 of your most important partners locked in a room, how are you supposed to locked in a room, by the way, for 6 days straight? How exactly do you reconcile that if you have a closing going on at the same time? There are some people who manage to keep a practice going while they run a big firm. I'm not that good a person. So a couple of years in, I kind of migrated away from practice. And so I had 12 years then of running the place. And then I hung around a couple of years after that, probably a couple of years longer than I should have. But anyway, before I took the leap into recruiting.
The time that you accepted your offer to join Morrison and Foerster, was there something in particular that stood out to you about the firm?
At the time, it was thought of as being a progressive place, not a particularly stuffy place. Today, being gay is kind of the least interesting thing on many people's resume. At the time, it was kind of more of a thing, shall we say. And it was important to me there in 1982 that I go to a place that was going to be chill, to use a more modern phrase about it. And so I came out to them before I accepted an offer, and I thought it would be a good place that would respect me for my talents.
So we'll get into your time with Morrison and Foerster a little bit later, but can you tell us about your current work with Major Lindsay in Africa?
Sure. It is a kind of a perfect third act for my career. I described the practice act and then the running a law firm act. And now in my third act, I don't make it sound like I don't take it seriously, but it's a little bit coasting on all the connections and the learning that I got out of the first two chapters. I partner recruiting is contingent, meaning I get paid when when a candidate I'm working with accepts an offer, and I only work with candidates I like, and I have the luxury that if I don't think a candidate is being straight with me or is not going to benefit from my advice or refuses to take important advice, I I encourage them to work with somebody else, and that's just fine. And many days I feel great about what I do. In fact, my most satisfying placements are not necessarily the most lucrative ones. The people I think of that I'm proudest of having helped are non-share partners at Kirkland that are trapped in a subservient role when their talents actually warrant a bigger stage, and I'm able to help them find that bigger stage that lets them flower. That's a lot more fun, frankly, than just moving your standard IP litigator with a $10 million practice from one big shop to another. I should add, I get to traffic in the same circles I trafficked in when I was chair of the firm. I still get to call up people who run law firms and give them a piece of my mind or compliment them. And they can thank me or hang up, but they usually take my phone calls, particularly if I'm working with a good candidate.
In an ABA article, you describe your transition into the senior attorney recruiting space as your quote unquote escape fantasy. How hard has it been to transition from an executive leader at a major big law firm to an executive recruiter?
Well, I suppose two things. One is it's one thing to run a professional services firm, and it's another thing to be just a participant. And as I said when I stepped down from being chair of MoFo, there are days I miss having the job. There are days I miss flying around the globe, showing up, giving speeches, kissing babies, pressing flesh. There are days I miss having that job. There are very few days I miss doing the job of convincing opinionated professionals to embrace change, which is shorthand for two-thirds of what a law firm chair does. So when I went to another professional services firm, I think you can ask anyone in leadership at Major Lindsay, and I think I probably volunteered my advice on anything related to how to run the place, maybe something between 0 and 1 time. It's just not a job I want, and if you don't want the job, don't meddle. So staying out of leadership has been very easy for me. Then substantively, in other words, the substance of what's involved in moving a partner from one firm to another, the only experience in that process that I haven't personally done many, many, many times is I have not changed law firms. I never changed law firms as a partner. So the only law firm I ever left fired me. So I don't exactly have that one notch in my belt. But a lot of other people have that experience. So what I do have is when I was chair of MoFo, probably hired 120 lateral partners. I'm not quite sure. I probably made indicative offers to another 100 or more. So if it comes to how do you put together a deal to convince somebody to leave their current firm, how can you structure things to protect the firm and the candidate? How do you exit a firm without burning bridges? I've got a PhD in each of those things. So most of what new recruiters struggle with was kind of old hat for me.
That must have been comforting.
Yes, people still, it's very sweet. Recruiters with a lot of experience at Major Lindsay, a lot more than I have, still occasionally call me up for advice, which is touching. And they might even actually want it. So yeah, it's very nice of them.
You were recently featured in an article on Law 360 in which you discussed the current competitive market for law firms and the things that law firms should focus on as part of their marketing strategies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, there are a couple of major arcs in the delivery of legal services that have been true at least from when I started practice through to the current day. And they continue, and some of them accelerate. One of them is increasing specialization. There was a day when you would bring your lawyer to a meeting who was known for doing a big range of type of transaction. And today, there are very few lawyers who have the credential to be able to do that, because the expectation is, if you're coming in to do a Series C financing for an early stage company, everybody in the room knows what the standard terms are for a Series C financing and the range of outcomes for any particular topic you're negotiating. And if you bring a lawyer who hasn't done that before, many, many times before, somebody's going to pull you aside and say, buddy, you got the wrong lawyer. There was more tolerance for learning on the job, for facing a new challenge and coming up with a new way to do it in the 80s. Another symptom of that I described in the early 80s, Crocker Bank was a third of the work for Morrison and Foerster. And Crocker sent every deal to MoFo. And I did transactions that the bank had not done before, MoFo hadn't done before, sure as hell hadn't done before. And we would cook up a way to do it. I just don't think that happens much anymore. A bank would hire a firm that had done that kind of deal a dozen times before, so that the technology had already been mastered and nobody was learning on the job. And this, by the way, is part of why you see billing rates have, if I had a nickel for every article written about how billing rates can't continue to increase, that article has been written every year, probably since the mid-1970s. And it continues apace. It's just the numbers are much larger. But this reflects that the standards of practice are incredibly higher than they were. The things you choose to compete at in the legal market, you better be really damn good at, because the market will not tolerate a lack of a very high level of expertise and experience. And expertise and experience is expensive because there are very few people who can provide it by definition, and that means you can ask a higher price for your services. So all that is a setup for my point being, one of these great arcs is of greater specialization. The corollary to greater specialization is greater market segmentation. Some of those things you get specialized in are more valuable than others, or at least harder expertise to develop. So knowing what KKR and TPG expect in a private equity investment of a certain scale for a certain percentage of a target company is a harder expertise to develop, a rarer expertise than knowing how to deal with a wrongful termination claim. And accordingly, Kirkland & Ellis has higher billing rates than Jackson Lewis, labor and employment firm. They're equally fine lawyers, perhaps, but one is just a much harder collection of expertise that is much rarer in the market. And therefore, you find firms that are able to deliver the rarest expertise billing at phenomenally higher multiples of what firms are billing at that provide more commonly available expertise. So, but that leads to my advice, which is you better know what it is you're selling and why you're the one to sell it. And firms that don't are not in a good place.
So why do you suppose it is that the market is now so highly segmented when there really hasn't been significant changes in the substantive law relative to what it had existed in past several decades?
Well, I think that those things that are hardest to learn are in great demand. Private equity has become, private equity representation across the board has become something of the holy grail for multi-office corporate law firm practices. And there are there are firms that have relationships with the largest private equity players, and most firms do not. And that is a huge driver of high-end market segmentation. And in terms of scale, I think if you read the Hildebrandt Citibank analysis, there's an argument that no one will catch up in scale to Kirkland and Latham. They've simply achieved a scale and a velocity that has left other firms behind. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not a lot of great firms doing great work that page per page, however you describe it, case per case, can stand up perfectly well against a Latham and a Kirkland. But it's a question of just scale of practice and the geographic reach and their capacity to dig into a very large profit pool to pay candidates whatever it is they choose for the market to be for those candidates.
Do you think that other firms can emulate Latham and Kirkland in what they were able to do in terms of business strategy and positioning?
There's an argument that it may be too late. Again, you can emulate the quality, you can emulate the practice, but I float as a hypothesis that no firm is going to be able to get to their scale. They're simply going to be in a class by themselves in terms of scale. And over time, scale enables strategic risk and investment because when you're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar profit pool, the risk involved in paying $30 million partner is really minimal. If you're dealing with a multi-$100 million profit pool, $30 million partner is a big bet.
So among those law firms who do practice in those highly desirable and segmented parts of the market, what are ways that they can distinguish themselves to stand out from other market competitors?
Well, knowing what they do. And as I said, when I say nobody's going to catch up, I don't mean there won't be partners making huge amounts of money representing some really fascinating clients at those other firms. Certainly there are, the blue chip New York firms still occupy a place in the market that is hugely enviable. And I think by and large, they know what they do and they know what they are selling and they're pricing themselves accordingly. I think when you get out of the AmLaw top 20, I think it's more of a challenge to figure out first where you want to be and can you get there. And it's a different strategy for every firm depending on its client mix. So the law firm version of you are what you eat is you are who your clients are. And it's very hard if you have a significant client concentration in a particular industry, it's very hard to be something other than what that industry expects.
So at the other end of the spectrum are those law firms that provide what might be considered commodity level legal services.
Yes.
What are some of the ways that they can differentiate themselves from their competitors in the market?
Well, I will offer amateur suggestions because at least when I was running MoFo, we were expressly disclaiming that we were shooting for that. And by the way, that's not to say that I think less of a firm that aims precisely for commoditized practice. For some firms, it is a really good choice because it may be the choice that's available to them. And there, I think you have to look to how do you do it faster, cheaper, or potentially better integrated with other needs. I mean, for example, I think the labor and employment firms, several of them, have gone national and global. I don't think they were necessarily cheaper providers. In fact, they're probably slightly more expensive than using a purely local option, but by being able to provide one-stop shopping for a large employer to handle, 47 states rather than 2, that's a competitive advantage. To be able to provide global reach so that when you do a layoff, when a multinational company does a layoff today, it's unlikely it's just in one country. And so being able to go to one place and say, we're getting rid of 4,700 employees next week. Please tell us what's involved in, consultation, RIF consultation in the UK, whatever the hell you might want to do in France, and the 12 or 14 states where we have locations in the US. That's a competitive advantage. So I offer that up as one, for better or worse, one pretty commoditized area of the law, but which several firms have, through geographic reach, I think, distinguished themselves. And similarly, there may be other examples of work that's become commoditized where either through geographic reach, through being able to offer something else at the same time, whether it's, for example, for a technology company, probably they need their executive comp arrangements to be informed by a pretty good knowledge of intellectual property law so that they make sure they keep what the inventor invents. And that means that even though there's a cheaper shop to do your executive comp contracts down the road, you're going to work with instead a credible technology firm that has an executive comp expertise because that expertise has been honed in the context of important IP.
Those are great insights. I'd like to bring you back for a second episode if you're willing. Thanks for being with us today, Keith.
My pleasure, Steve.